with that in mind, so how do we differentiate between what is genuinely Islamic from what is cultural tradition in various Muslim majority societies?
Yeah, no, that's a great. Yeah, obviously we touched a little bit on it, but like, um, and so it's important to understand the role of culture in Islam before we sort of continue. So Islam, when it comes to legal rulings, has this concept of urf, which means like culture or custom, and basically the point of that is there are certain customs that do inform Islamic law. So the practice of Islam is going to differ, and that has to do with usually soft elements. So, like for example, what is rude? What does it mean to be a rude person, for example? Like in many societies, if you shake someone's hand with the wrong hand, like that's seen as rude. But in America, if I fist bump someone with the left hand, like no one's really gonna care. So like that's something that's culturally based. But Islam tells us to be upright in character, so that's going to be look differently depending on society. So that's a good example of like, okay, there is a plurality there. But at the same time, we ultimately go back to the two main sources of Islam, which is the Quran and the Sunnah, or the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. And if people are doing things in a culture that go against the principles that are clearly set out in those two sources, then those are cultural practices that go against Islam. So I think the biggest one that often gets a lot of attention would be FGM, or female genital mutilation. So Islam completely prohibits this practice, where like the extreme forms of it. Islam completely prohibits this, but this is still a practice in some cultures, not necessarily Muslim, like because they're Muslim. It's a practice in certain parts of the world. So like you see it in certain parts of Africa.
Yeah,
It's
it's sort
practiced
of
by
like
Christians, animists, and Muslims.
Yeah.
But Islam completely prohibits this, and so that would be an example. Like, okay, if we go to the two main sources, then we can see that this is not allowed. And then other examples would be like honor killing, stuff like that. Like those are purely culturally based things, and Islam prohibits murder and whatnot. So that's how we sort of differentiate. So you have to study the aspects of the religion itself in order to get the clear prohibitions, and then from that, all the cultures have to be filtered through that lens in order to all cultural practices have to go through that lens in order to be seen as valid. So yeah.
yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Also, like that need to differentiate, and I think like for those societies, um, where there are they follow the same practice, such as I guess female like circumcision and those extreme practices are widespread throughout many religions. Therefore, you're able to distinguish that culture is the root of the problem. What do you think about situations where the cultural traditions are limited to Islamic regions?
So can you give me an example of like a tradition that you're thinking of where it's like,
I'd say like I can't think of one on the spot, but like something that maybe culturally happens in Saudi Arabia or in the parts of the Middle East that are more primarily Islamic.
um,
I think I could think of one. Like I guess the controversy revolving around females driving in cars in Saudi Arabia. I guess there's a lot of misconception with regard to whether that's a Saudi Arabian thing or is that an Islam thing. And because you can't really compare it to the other monolithic religions around the world, a lot of people, I guess, attribute it to the religion itself, whereas it might just be a regional disposition.
yeah, so Islam has really nothing against women driving cars. It's Saudi Arabia for the longest time was like the only country that actually had that specific ruling, and that has to do with a lot of political and also sort of religious factors as well. So, excuse me. Saudi Arabia, a lot of their legal rulings come from a super strict, very puritanical strand of Islam that most of the vast majority of Muslims would reject. And so they gave certain rulings saying that women were prohibited from driving, but that's actually the only country where that actually happened. Every single other Muslim country is has had no problem with women driving cars,
Mhm.
and Saudi Arabia recently got rid of this law too. But no, I see what you're saying. That's not has nothing to do with culture. I guess you could contribute it to religion, but I think you could contribute it to religion the same way that like some radical Christian group might have some
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
idea
Yeah.
about like, oh, we should do this with the witches or whatever.
No,
Um,
yeah. I totally understand that, especially like
yeah,
from like Israel, like there are a lot of there's like a huge like contention between the majority of regular to maybe even traditionally Orthodox Jews and the Hasidic Jews. And a lot of people don't really
Hmm.
associate with Hasidic Jews as much because of the more radical policies that they push out that I guess are similar to like the parallels you see between um, typical countries that are Islamic and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, yeah.
So I guess just like keeping in mind those differences is fundamental, even if that's not something that you have within your religion, so that you can differentiate between the two in other religions such as Islam.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it.
I don't know, just to maybe it's a half-baked argument, but just to play maybe devil's advocate.
Yeah.
So in Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, which was it was a secular party, effectively, women experienced a lot more rights, and so did other minorities and the LGBTQ and whatnot. So how come? And then once the Islamic organizations took over, all of that went away. So how could you attribute that to culture and not religion if there seems to be there seems to be a variable of religion that changed, and then from that everything else changed? If that makes
Well,
sense.
I'd have to know the specific rights you're referring to, but like there are certain rights that Islam gives to women. There are certain things that, like for example, Western society's rights gives to women that Islam doesn't, and not because we see women as inferior. It's just that, like I mentioned earlier, like men and women have different responsibilities within society. So if a regime came in power that was like saying like women can't, I don't know, leave the house or women have to do X, Y, and Z, like super strict rules or whatever that don't really have that much of a basis in Islam, then we would reject those things. But at the same time, if there are rules that were saying, like, I'm trying to think of an example, like, because it depends on like certain, because there's a difference obviously between like spiritual commandments and like physical laws imposed by state. So I'd have to. I don't know too much about that situation, but like if there's basically, like I said, you have to just go back to the original sources and see if the rights that are being given to women and other minorities or whatever are the same as what is upheld by Islam, then we would sort of agree with that. But if there's things that go too far or whatever, then we would not we would not support those. But when it comes to like religious minorities, like Islam historically has guaranteed the protection of Christians and Jews, and in some cases, like obviously other religious groups, under the rule of Islam. So Islam has no problem with like a Muslim society ruling over a plural, like a religiously plural one. Like that's not really an issue Islamically. There are some radical groups like that take over governments and impose super strict ruling, and but that those are un-Islamic practices.
Hmm. Yeah, I
Okay,
think
yeah.
you need to.
I was just, it was half baked, really. I was just thinking about
No,
the Baath party, and
yeah, no, I appreciate the questioning. Like any, this is good. Like I like the sort of discussion and whatnot.
Yeah.